Good afternoon and welcome to the first Europe session of the series of webinars we're holding on the 70th anniversary of UNHCR Statute. These webinars started this morning, they continue again on Thursday, and the closing plenaries are on Wednesday the 27th. I am so grateful that you could all join and listen to our fantastic collection of speakers that we have. I should point out that our partners, Asile 20, are hosting a second European set of conversations immediately after ours, well, 15 minutes after we finish. Before I start, let me give you the usual housekeeping rules. If you were actually here in a conference room at the University of Essex, I'd now be telling you where the restrooms are and what to do in case of a fire alarm. Here we've got slightly different housekeeping rules. If you have any technical problems with the platform, the session is actually being live streamed on the Human Rights Centre YouTube channel, and the link is in the chat box. It uses less bandwidth than Zoom, but it does not allow for the same interactivity. To connect to it, just follow the link that you now see. Interpretation is available in English and Spanish, and I'm not certain, I believe French, but maybe not. And it's definitely available also through International Sign Language, and the International Signer will be pinned to the screen throughout all the presentations. So there is no need to have any concern that they will suddenly vanish off, no matter what you do with your Zoom view. You do need, I believe, to have the latest version of Zoom downloaded to you in order to use the interpretation function. You will also see at the bottom a possibility of using closed captioning. We have closed captioning running this afternoon, and if you click on there, you will see live closed captioning in the chat. Q&A. As always, your active participation in today's discussion is encouraged, and you can submit questions and comments throughout the event. They are being monitored, and once we've finished the panelists' presentations, we hope to have a very helpful, a very useful Q&A session where they will be answering questions you've included in the Q&A. Use the Q&A at the bottom of the screen to submit your questions to the panel. So, without further ado, I will move into the conference proper and start by listing our panelists and introducing them to you. The first panelist is Ms. Rossella Pagliuchi-Lor. She took up her post as UNHCR's representative to the United Kingdom in December 2018. Prior to this, she had served 2 years as Director for External Relations at UNHCR's headquarters in Geneva. Ms. Pagliuchi-Lor has over 30 years of experience in refugee and humanitarian work and has served UNHCR in a diverse set of countries, including Pakistan, Nepal, Iraq, Kenya, Belgium, Hungary, and Italy. Ms. Pagliuchi-Lor holds a master's degree in political science, international relations from the University La Sapienza in Rome, Italy. Our second panelist is Dr. Ahmed Shaheed. He is a senior lecturer in the School of Law at the University of Essex, and he's also director of the Human Rights Centre's Research Methods Summer School and co-deputy director of the Human Rights Centre at the University of Essex. He's currently UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion and belief, having previously served as UN Special Rapporteur on human rights in Iran. Dr. Shaheed is a member of the Advisory Committee on Interfaith Dialogue at the UN Office on Genocide Prevention and Responsibility to Protect, and the founding chair of the Universal Rights Group. Third panelist is Claire Simmons. Claire Simmons is a PhD candidate at the University of Essex Law School and Human Rights Centre, specialising in international humanitarian law and human rights law. She is also research officer for the Global Academic Interdisciplinary Network that has helped put this conference together over the 10 days. And to be perfectly honest, without Claire, this conference would never have happened. Claire has worked with the British Red Cross and local human rights organisations in Thailand, France, and the UK. She is co-author of the ICRC Geneva Academy 2019 guidelines on investigating violations of international humanitarian law. Our final panellist is Abdikadir Bare Abikar, who is a dedicated and passionate educator with over 8 years of professional teaching experience in diverse classroom settings at the primary, secondary and university levels in Dadaab, Kenya. He holds a BA in Geography and a Masters of Education from York University, Canada. He had the unique opportunity to study and later teach with the Borderless Higher Education for Refugees, BHER, project in Dadaab refugee camp. For the duration of his graduate studies, Abikar was a research assistant with BHER and the Connected Learning in Crisis Consortium, CLCC, where he was able to engage global academia through his research, publications and presentations, international conferences on education in emergencies and displacement contexts. His work has been published by Forced Migration Review. After living in Dadaab for most of his life, Abikar recently moved to Mogadishu, Somalia, where he hopes to improve national education systems and gender equality initiatives. Currently, he is busy writing an article on how durable solutions on offer in the Dadaab refugee camp affect the aspirations of refugee youth in post-secondary education. These panelists, I am certain, will provide us with a wonderful set of comments and discussion, which I hope will prompt good questions in the Q&A boxes. I turn first to Rossella. Rossella, the international protection of refugees has been UNHCR's mandate since 1950. What does UNHCR understand by the term protection? A word of many, possibly too many meanings.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much, Geoff. Well, of course, according to its statute, UNHCR is mandated to provide international protection and durable solution to the problems of refugees. And international protection in the 50s had a very univocal meaning. It really meant diplomatic and legal protection. Refugees were people who lacked the protection of their own government, and therefore an organization was established to be, if you wish, the consulate of refugees. Now, the statute was drafted alongside the Refugee Convention with the notion that the two would work as an integrated system. Governments would provide asylum and facilitate the integration of refugees, and UNHCR on its side would represent their needs, promote the drafting and the application of agreements, strengthen the international protection regime, etc., etc. So generally, it was expected that UNHCR would exercise its mandate at the political and legal level and not individual level, and there are historical reasons for that. On its side, of course, the Refugee Convention contained an article, Article 35, that includes a corresponding obligation for states to cooperate with UNHCR. Now, because of its role, in fact, UNHCR was explicitly meant to be an independent organization. And in fact, its executive committee that today includes 106 countries from all regions of the world, has only an advisory role, which is very different from what is the case with similar bodies for other international organizations. Now, the correspondence between the statute and the convention was not perfect then, it is now. In other words, the statute is universally applicable, whereas the convention, of course, being a convention, is only applicable in countries that have adopted it. And even more, of course, not all countries that have ratified the convention actually have introduced measures for its implementation. So in this countries, UNHCR protection role has actually become one of replacement or substitution. In this case, not substitution for national protection, the national protection that refugees lack, but for the protection of the countries of asylum themselves. Now, there has been a shift, however, in the general understanding of protection, and that has come because of three main reasons. One is the fact, of course, the growth in the number of humanitarian crises occurring in countries around the world, often in situations of extreme fragility or downright conflict. There has been, so there are many more interventions and many more actors on the scene. And of course, there's been the development of human rights law. So today, the concept of protection is usually understood to encompass all activities aimed at ensuring the full respect of the full respect of the rights of the individuals in accordance with the spirit and the letter of the relevant bodies of law. So essentially, human rights law, humanitarian law, and refugee law. Now, so this expands the sense of the approach to protection from one of protection as responsibility grounded in a specific mandate to if you wish, protection as a set of activities. Now, we can discuss whether the word protection nowadays is used a little bit too freely, and I think it would be an interesting discussion, and whether this is actually helpful. If all activities aimed at ensuring the full respect of the human rights of individuals in accordance with the letter, etc., protection, then of course I can't really think of what in a humanitarian intervention is not protection. Clearly, training the police and placing lockable doors on latrines are both very, very important. Are they the same thing? I think, again, as I said, this is an interesting discussion that probably deserves a separate session. What, however, I think is important is that regardless of how we define it, and I think there are some benefits in considering in this broader sense of protection, because I think it firmly places the question of centrality of protection as a purpose of humanitarian action elsewhere. So it has its use. Let's put it this way. But I think we should be careful also not to overclaim sometimes protection. And here I go a bit with Marc Dubois, who I think very rightly highlighted the risk of losing credibility if we claim that we can provide protection, for example, from violence in a manner that, of course, humanitarians cannot do. Some 30 years ago, when I introduced myself as a protection officer, a senior police officer in Pakistan looked at me thoughtfully for a minute and then said, "You don't look very strong." I think he had a point. Now, it may seem that with what I've said that I go along with those who along the years have been saying that UNHCR should really limit itself to its core mandate of providing legal and diplomatic protection and stay out of assistance. Now, I actually do not. And I do not because I've been a protection officer in the field, and I've seen how, to what extent, the protection as advocacy for standards and for government action is actually sustained and strengthened by being seen as the bringers of material assistance. Our mandate is very, very strong in international law, but it's a lot less so sometimes on dusty roads. The other reason why I think it's important for UNHCR to continue to be involved in this in humanitarian assistance, whatever we want to call it, I think it has to do with the fact that it gives us an entry point in the lives of refugees, and therefore an understanding that then can drive much better policy formulation and guidance, and which is indeed what constitutes our core mandate. So it makes us a lot better in what we are required to do. So whatever we call it, as I said, I believe really that UNHCR's mandate, our protection mandate, does require a somewhat broader intervention in the real world to make us, to help to strengthen our hand. And this is particularly so because I think we're seeing so many countries increasingly uninterested in following standards per se. So I think I'm done with my 5 minutes, Geoff, and I hand over the floor.
Yeah, I remember several years ago having a chat with Nick Morris, who was in operations, and saying there's not much point protecting a dead refugee. And it's that very point. Can I turn now to Ahmed? Ahmed, in international human rights law, we talk about respect, protect, and fulfill rights. How would you explain the concept of protecting rights?
Right. Thank you very much, Geoff, for inviting me to join this session. And congratulations to UNHCR and to my 6 colleagues, especially Geoff, for putting together this impressive program to mark the 70th anniversary of the Refugee Convention. In response to your question, I want to begin by highlighting that international refugee law and human rights law overlap and are complementary, and therefore IHRL, human rights law, provides additional protections for refugees through the exercise and enjoyment of their human rights. International human rights law provides a wide range of rights for every human being, regardless of whether one is a refugee or not. And as duty bearers, states are obligated to carry out due diligence to ensure that rights are effective and practical and not theoretical and or illusory, to borrow language from the European Court of Human Rights. The due diligence requirement also points to the importance of duty bearers paying particular attention to persons in vulnerable situations. And as persons in vulnerable situations, the protections offered by IHRL to refugees can be and are indeed very important. The tripartite framework of respect, protect, and fulfill highlights the wide-ranging and multi-layered nature of state obligations under international human rights law. The obligation to respect requires that states do not engage in activities that violate rights of those subject to its jurisdiction, i.e. a duty of restraint. The closure of borders to refugees, for example, would be a violation of that duty to respect the right of everyone to seek asylum under criteria established by international law, as would be the forcible return of a refugee in violation of the principle of non-refoulement. The duty to protect entails positive obligations upon states to ensure that rights enjoy effective protection and third parties do not abuse those rights. The simplest example for me to cite here, based on my work, is where people in flight continue to face the threats to their life, which made them flee in the first place. I've come across examples where refugees may be housed in centers for processing in ways that expose them to the types of threats they faced to begin with, such as religious dissenters being housed together with others from the same country on the basis of a shared nationality. The duty to fulfill rights requires that states make provision for everyone to claim, exercise, and enjoy their rights effectively. In the context of refugees, this would entail being able to apply for asylum, being able to present their case to pertinent authorities, and to have an effective and impartial hearing on that. In the context of refugee protection, this also includes international cooperation to facilitate the right to seek asylum, to ensure that individuals are not indirectly forced to return to a country in violation of the principle of non-refoulement. Given that human rights are interdependent and indivisible, the duty to fulfill rights of refugees can engage a whole range of other rights, such as housing, education, healthcare, in addition to facilitating those rights directly linked to claiming one's status as a refugee. To illustrate my points by example, let me refer to the latest communication on public record from the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of migrants, which he wrote to the government of Greece about a year ago, following the closure of Greece's border for about a month, subsequent to Turkey's decision at the time to open its borders to anyone wishing to cross to Europe. Among the many concerns and queries he raised in his letter to the government of Greece, the following stand out, and they correspond to the three types of state obligations we are talking about. His first question was to ask the government to explain how the suspension of asylum applications complied with international law, especially in regard to the right to seek asylum and the principle of non-refoulement. Of course, pointing out that such a suspension has no basis in international human rights law. A second question he raised was to ask for information on measures undertaken to ensure the safety of refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants. Of course, states have obligation to protect them against violence, against human trafficking, and other violations and abuses of their rights. The third question he raised was asking for plans by the government of Greece to alleviate the critical conditions facing refugees and asylum seekers in regard to housing and congestion, especially in the islands in the Aegean Sea. Now, these three questions illustrate the multi-layered nature of the type of protections that are sought, and the type of duties upon state to ensure through due diligence that people are effectively able to exercise their right to seek asylum. Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmed. Can I turn now to you, Claire? How has the legal regime of protection of displaced persons under international humanitarian law changed in the last 70 years?
Thank you, Geoff. So the thing about protection of displaced people in armed conflict is that it very much depends where you are and where you end up as a result of displacement. International humanitarian law, or IHL, it's also called the law of armed conflict, the law of war. It's the law that regulates situations of armed conflict. But this means it's only applicable in the area where that are involved in the armed conflict. So once a displaced person leaves such an area, the law protecting them can change. So with this in mind, I want to quickly address how IHL does protect displaced people, but also how it interplays with other bodies of law, like refugee law and human rights law, as Dr. Shaheed mentioned, and how these things might have changed over the past 70 years. The last 70 years is actually a convenient time frame to look back on, because as well as the founding of the UNHCR Statute, it was also 70 years ago that the first states ratified the 4 Geneva Conventions of 1949. These are not the first IHL treaties by any means, but they do contain some of the most important codification of IHL rules. So in these 70 years, the Geneva Conventions have actually achieved universal ratification. They've been ratified by all UN member states. This is a massive achievement for a treaty. And their additional protocols of 1977 were also developed in this time, providing even more detailed rules of protection. Some of you may have heard Helen Durham, Director of International Law and Policy of the ICRC, speaking on IHL in yesterday's first opening ceremony. And I won't repeat what she said, but I do want to highlight briefly how IHL protects displaced people, and that's in 3 different ways. First of all, IHL protects from displacement. It's been said many times, if IHL was respected, there would be much less displacement due to armed conflict, both internal and cross-border displacement. There are direct rules under IHL prohibiting the forcible displacement of civilians, but there are also rules which indirectly protect from displacement. For example, prohibiting destruction of objects indispensable to survival. Think of water, food, and hospitals. Or very simply prohibiting the direct targeting of civilians, which can cause displacement. But IHL also protects people during displacement, if they're still in an armed conflict zone. Because most refugees and IDPs are civilians, they benefit from the protections under IHL not to be targeted and to be humanely treated, amongst other things. And finally, IHL also provides some protection for returnees, because parties to an armed conflict must enable the safe return of displaced people when possible. But there are also other rules like restricting the use of landmines, which are important for safe and voluntary return. But even in conflict, IHL rarely applies on its own, and a person experiencing displacement will rarely fall under only one legal regime. And I want to comment briefly on this interplay. IHL is a separate body of public international law from refugee law or international human rights law, and as Geoff famously tells all his students, they are separate penguins of international law. But an important development over the last 70 years has been the better recognition of how these bodies of law work together, how the penguins dance together, if you will. These different bodies of law have increasingly been recognized as providing complementary protection. They are different, yes, but they also have a common approach to principles of humanity and protection. For example, interpreting what humane treatment means is best done by looking at both IHL and human rights law. For example, tying it into concepts of dignity and what this means in practice. This complementarity is also seen in the way actors with mandates under these different bodies of law work together. For example, the ICRC and UNHCR. We can also see it in the development of soft law documents, so non-legally binding documents, which bring together the different bodies of law to try and focus on the best protection possible for those affected. For example, the 1998 Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement. This document explicitly states in its introduction that it reflects both human rights law and IHL. So IHL has developed and it's gained increasing ratification over the past 70 years. And the protection of other laws, such as human rights law, has also increased protection for displaced people in armed conflict. But more than the law, the most drastic change in the last 70 years is probably the nature of armed conflicts themselves, and this has had an impact on protection. The types of conflict, for example, we have seen a big decrease in the number of conflicts between two states, known as international armed conflicts, and an increase in non-international armed conflicts, namely internal conflicts or civil wars with armed groups. And it's these actors also in armed conflict that have also changed a lot. States are no longer the most prevalent actors in causing displacement. And even looking after the displaced, the role of non-state armed groups has become a lot more common. And I would also say that the politicization of displacement has changed with the change in the types of conflicts over the last 70 years. If we think of the polarizing dynamics during the Cold War, it was very much states against states, and refugees were seen as fleeing oppressive enemy regimes. But today, the discourse is perhaps less focused on enemy states, and instead there's a political rejection of the refugees themselves. And it's seen, for example, in Europe today with media and political messaging surrounding the so-called floods or waves of refugees. So to wrap up, the law on protection in armed conflict has somewhat changed in the last 70 years, but what has changed more is actually the very nature of armed conflict. The way in which the law is interpreted has also changed along with this, especially by recognizing a more holistic approach to protection and by considering the interplay of the different bodies of law. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. And for anybody moderately confused by the reference to penguins, it is the fact that penguins are usually seen as all looking the same. And therefore, everybody thinks, well, sort of, they're all the same. And in the same way, subdisciplines of international law, like international human rights law, international law of armed conflict, international refugee law, are sometimes treated as though they're identical. And you can take parts of one and just transfer them into another. The very nature of those different subdisciplines of international law means that any cross-fertilization has to be thought through carefully. And that's why I like the penguin analogy, but more on that on some other occasion, not now. At this moment, I must turn to Abikar. Abikar, your experience is so fundamental to addressing the question of how can education provide protection for refugees?
Thank you, Geoff. This is great. Thank you so much, Geoff, for inviting me to join this session. And congratulate to UNHCR for the long suffering the refugee people. The knowledge I got from online universities in the project of BHR, Borderless Higher Education for Refugee, prepared me to better position myself to go back to my country and help those in need through my work with UNHCR, United Nations. I feel independent and confident that I can contribute to my country's stability directly or indirectly. Education empowered me to participate in decision-making areas of my level in my own country. My voice sounds better with education acquired. And thus educating a refugee to protect the displaced person. So in this question of protection, how can education provides protection for refugees? I will say that education provides the self-confidence to the educator to think differently in survival. thus giving them the world good of ideas. I remember when people traveled to the camps for 1991 in Somalia, for those with basic needs benefited better than those without, basic education from Somalia, as compared to, for example, including my parents directly from the jungles or the bush with their cattle and animals, and had no knowledge of other means of surviving other than only rearing animals. As we speak today, those displaced persons who benefited from either resettlement opportunities or created small businesses were the people with, essential bits of knowledge. And thus, it is through education that provides the kind of protection that any person would want. My mother told me that if our ration cards were posted for resettlement interviews by UNHCR, they would decline and never had, any reasons for the refusals. And that happens to very many, parents that had no education. There was also another scenario where families are resettled, and that's why I normally use, education as a protection. So the family are resettled, and they are never knowing where to go. But unfortunately, someone was paying all the amount of travel to come to United Nations, only just to buy some parts of their bodies, like maybe kidneys and all that, and they never knew it. So one of the family member, a child at the age between 10 to 12 years, looked at where the family was dropped by the taxi, and she saw that something written like operation will be done and all these things, and they were frightened to go back and say that these people want our organs, and that's the reason why we are resettled in this point. So I say, education not only in the directions of protecting, like giving food, but mentally, socially, politically, education provides the person with that confidence. So that's why I say that education provides protection and can be of values of displaced persons in the camp. And recently, the people I met in in Somalia, the youths that came from in Dadaab, are doing a brilliant job, and it's because of the education they have received. They're using as a shield to do a lot of life worthy things. So back to you, Geoff. Thank you.
Thank you, Abikar, for that very personal but very important intervention. Can I come back to you, Rossella? We're 70 years into a mandate that was originally planned to last a mere 3. How does UNHCR understand protection today, especially in the light of the 2018 Global Compact on Refugees?
Well, the fundamentals of protection really haven't changed, nor has unfortunately changed the need for it. And I think Ahmed Shaheed's comments on what he saw, I think, are a very good example of what I'm talking about. The protection mandate, the core protection mandate, is, I think, considerably under threat at the moment. We've been witnessing a tendency to depart from multilateralism and the conception of international relations that speaks to rules. And of course, our mandate is both entrenched in international law, and it solely relies really on the authority of the High Commissioner. It has no teeth per se. Politically, refugees are depicted in a negative light, and while this is not entirely new, we are seeing it's leading to the loss, or anyway, the weakening of what is one of the main control systems, which is basically states holding each other accountable. This is weakening also because some states are really losing their credibility in that they're showing themselves unwilling to do what they're asking others to do, or because by allowing certain slippages, they hope to open sort of the space for themselves to do the same. Fortunately, in many parts of the world, of course, public opinion remains supportive. Civil society is very active, and of course, there is the invaluable work that judicial bodies are doing to shore up the system. The Global Compact on refugees represent really an expression of our traditional mandate of specifically the function of trying to promote agreements between states with a view to improving the situation of refugees. Now, much has been said about the fact that the Global Compact is too cautious, is not binding, it's unambitious, but I think we have to be realistic. The Compact, like also the 51 Convention and everything else, any other international instrument, is a document of compromise. We could have written a wonderful instrument, but then it would have probably remained literature. So we have to be realistic and perhaps appreciate the fact that the Global Compact is at least an attempt, and so far doing not too badly, about reversing the trends that I was describing by focusing on the all-important question of international cooperation and responsibility and burden sharing, without which the asylum system, the international protection system, simply cannot survive. The Global Compact relies on existing treaties and on UNHCR's mandate. That's a given. So it tries to build on that, and it attempts to strengthen states' resolve to cooperate to solve some of the critical issues that affect refugees, and indeed the countries in which they find themselves in. Because of course, I mean, we talk about protection, and we rightly focus on non-refoulement, admission at the border, etc. These are the fundamentals. Without those, nothing else matters. As you Geoff said, there's no protecting a dead refugee. But at the same time, that's really not enough. You have to consider that somebody who is a refugee for 5 years, statistically, is likely to remain a refugee for about 20. And 85% of refugees worldwide find themselves in countries that are themselves overstretched, with often significant problems in terms of weak infrastructure, insufficient services even for their own citizens, and often really non-viable job markets. Now, frankly, lack of a decent livelihood and lack of access to education, of which Abikar so eloquently spoke, are really the mother of most of the protection problems we see. If refugees could achieve a degree of normalcy in terms of being able to be self-reliant, to access education, to go on with their lives, many of the issues that we try then to address through humanitarian interventions wouldn't arise. Now, the Compact, of course, recognizes also that the lives of the refugees are inextricably linked to those of the host communities. And often, of course, refugees live among the most marginalized in their own countries. It makes it important, though certainly not new, I think, I'm sure that you will recall this has been a discussion since the 60s, the early 70s, sorry, that makes the link between development and humanitarian interventions. And it seeks to link the two by involving a far greater range of actors. For the first time, we have big financial institutions, development banks, the World Bank, the Asian Development Banks, and others involved. And that's really, quite frankly, also is where the big money is. And they're involved in trying to support those countries that are doing the good, they're really fulfilling the greater good for the international community by taking care of a very large number of refugees despite their challenges. I think it's important, and it's important to sort of think about refugee crisis as a collective challenge, and therefore to seek the assistance and the support of everyone. We have been reaching out, as you know, to faith-based groups, to academia, of course, and this is what this particular event is an example of that. Individuals, private sector, trying to find that sweet spot that brings everyone together for the greater good of refugees and their host communities, and that actively establishes a basis for solutions. Now, perhaps on closing, I would like also to notice that we are indeed one of the elements that is now being put in far sharper light is the inclusion and leadership of the refugees themselves. I mean, it should have been like that from the beginning, to be honest. It kind of wasn't, it is definitely the time. And I think we're going to see the inclusion and the actual active participation of refugees in this far more in light, which is really the way it should be. Over to you.
Thank you. I would like to sort of just point out, I was doing some research for UNHCR in Niger in 2014 with my co-researcher Anna Magdalena Rouche, and we went to Difa in the southeast. And what was really important there was the way that UNHCR had coordinated the refugee community with the local regional government in order to make certain that the refugee voice was heard, both not just by UNHCR itself, but by the Nigerian authorities as well. And I think UNHCR has been trying to ensure the refugee voice is at the forefront for many, many years now. Ahmed, I'll come to you now for your second question. You are also, as well as one of my colleagues at Essex, the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion and Belief. In that capacity, how have you responded to protection needs?
Thank you. Before I respond, the point just made about all of us viewing the refugee crisis as a collective challenge, I think is a very, very important one. And in my UN mandate, and I'm one of 40 mandate holders with a global remit, the primary role we play, of course, to advance protections for human rights, primarily through the eyes and ears of the Human Rights Council, but also to be a voice for the voiceless when these rights are violated. But and of course, to carry out this role, we have a range of tools that we can use. This includes things like sending urgent appeals to countries or organizations to prevent violations that may be imminent, or to send allegation letters to seek redress when these have occurred, to undertake country visits with the state's consent, and of course on those visits make a special, if you like, focus on this issue, and to highlight emerging and existing obstacles to human rights via thematic studies analysis. And all of these tools, we could and we do keep a focus on those who are most vulnerable, and of course refugees are among those in a very vulnerable situation. In terms of my own work, the primary focus is to promote conditions in countries that would result in the ability of individuals to exercise and enjoy their right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion without being forced out of their countries. But when they've had to flee, I've examined conditions they face in countries of transit or in countries of resettlement by a range of engagements during my country visits. Thus, on my visit to Sri Lanka, a few months after the Easter Sunday bombing 2 years back, I visited and met with a number of refugees from Pakistan and the Middle East to examine their situation and raise a number of concerns with the government about the treatment they were facing. On my visit to the Netherlands, same year, I met with government officials working on refugee issues to inquire about their practices and, of course, make necessary recommendations as I felt were appropriate. On my visit to Tunisia 2 years back, I went to prisons where they were holding refugees whom they regard to be illegally transferred in the country. Of course, examine the issues they're facing and raise concerns with the government. Now, beyond these on-site visits and other advocacy tools, I have provided country-relevant information to assist authorities in processing refugee claims, often at the request of those seeking they have their claims processed. And where there is an intersection between refugee status and religious identity, I also highlight issues linked to integration or discrimination in countries that may be resettling refugees. But overall, of course, with some 50 mandates which look at thematic issues and 10 or 11 on country-specific issues, the system works as a total system. And we look at synergies on how we could collaborate in advancing the cases we make. And of course, also extending cooperation to other parts of the UN in highlighting the concerns about refugee situation and of ways of responding to the huge crisis we're all facing at the present time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmed. Can I turn now to Claire? Claire, you mentioned that the nature of conflict has changed over the past 70 years, but how has protection in practice, as well as the actors involved in this protection, changed in situations of armed conflict in that time? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Geoff. I think it is interesting because, as you said, with the changing nature of conflict, it's also affected the actors involved in the armed conflicts who's fighting the conflict. But this also has an impact on protection by these actors and other actors as well involved in armed conflict. So I would address this topic from two completely different angles. On the one hand, how the actors with a legal responsibility towards displaced people have changed, and especially the massive growth of the role of non-state actors in armed conflict over the last 70 years. But on the other hand, we have other actors who provide practical humanitarian assistance, and they've also had to adapt to the changing situations and in the way they work together, especially, for example, UNHCR and ICRC. So first of all, who has the legal obligations with regards to displaced people? The world is still very much focused on states, and states are definitely the primary duty bearers when it comes to legal obligations for displaced people. But in the last 70 years, the role of non-state actors has undoubtedly massively grown in a lot of areas, and not just conflict. If we think of the role of big businesses and companies now have in a lot of places. So states are no longer the main actors in armed conflict. Under IHL, non-state armed groups are legally bound by obligations, for example, obligations not to target civilians and to treat those within their care with humanity. Although it has to be said that the law regarding non-state actors is less developed and not as widely ratified. But regardless of the law, in reality, especially for IDPs, states are often either unwilling or able to provide protection to these people. In practice, non-state armed groups have a lot of interaction with displaced people. This is true in all three spheres: in causing displacement, providing protection during displacement, and the safe return or not of displaced people. This state of affairs, that non-state actors are in fact often in charge of displaced people, is reflected in part in the guiding principles on internal displacement. They do focus their obligations on states, and rightfully so, but they also explicitly state that they are aimed at all authorities, groups, and people, irrespective of their legal status. And in a sense, because the drafting of the guiding principles were very much along a needs-based approach. It identified needs of the IDPs before addressing how legal obligations of who could meet those needs. In fact, the guiding principles themselves have been used in training workshops on IDP protection with armed groups, and they have provided much needed guidance on what can be done in practice, a sort of checklist of how protection can be provided, and especially in situations where the law may not be clear. And there's other areas where armed groups have also committed to providing more protection regardless of the law, for example, through deeds of commitment coordinated by Geneva. A lot of these focus on armed groups who commit to not using anti-personal landmines, for example, something that's absolutely crucial in considering the safe return of displaced people. But I also wanted to comment briefly on a different type of actor, which has been central to the protection of displaced people, namely how the work of UNHCR and ICRC has evolved over the past 70 years, separately and together. Differences between the ICRC and the UNHCR are important. They are different legally, politically, and what they do in practice. But it's also the case that these two actors have complementary roles in providing protection, and some of their work is intrinsically linked. So much so that they have come to various official agreements over the years, such as the 1981 Manila Resolution and Statement of Policy. Legally, the mandate of UNHCR is primarily with refugees, people outside their country of origin. The mandate of ICRC, on the other hand, is focused within territories where conflict happens and lines up much more clearly with the protection of IDPs in this way. But as we are hearing throughout this conference, the mandates are not this clear-cut. The ICRC does in fact deal with refugees, especially when refugees find themselves in another or the same armed conflict across the border. And we know that UNHCR increasingly deals with population or displaced people who are not 1951 Convention refugees, such as IDPs or stateless people. This is a topic that's been covered in various panels across this week's conference. But most importantly, the two organizations have adapted to the practical realities on the ground, which, as we can see, have changed drastically over time. They have expertise in different areas which can be put to use as new situations arise, even if it does not fall strictly within their mandate. In many cases, it is simply that they have been on the ground when a population of displaced people have found themselves in their care, and they have provided emergency relief despite their status. The Central Tracing Agency of the ICRC is an example of adaptation to changing realities. It started as communications agency for prisoners of war to be in contact with their families, but it now uses its expertise in tracing services very broadly to detainees, civilians affected by conflict, to help families get back in contact. So in conclusion, I just wanted to highlight that although in the last 70 years we have seen many changes, not least in the way that UNHCR and ICRC have had to step up to provide protection, there is a pattern which perhaps has remained unchanged. And what hasn't changed is the humanitarian principles, which are core to both organizations and the laws that govern them. These become evident when we see them adapting to what makes humanitarian sense when unforeseen circumstances arise, and what makes sense in practice when the law becomes a bit fuzzy. Thanks, Geoff.
Thank you, Claire. I turn finally now to Abikar. How could education lead to a durable solution for displaced persons in the world, and in particular in the Dadaab refugee camp in Kenya?
Thank you so much, Geoff, again, for inviting me to respond to the second question, as education being a durable solution for the refugees. So this is an article I'm writing with British Institute of East Africa, and I just want to prove explaining to UNHCR that education could be, something durable that, if it is taken seriously, would be better by any other, aids that's given to the refugees. So everything, is in this world is competitive in today's world, and only those who have, the desire, skills, and knowledge can only survive, for better living life standard. By getting, a university education, I was qualified for higher, competitive jobs in Somalia. I'm still looking for a job now in Somalia. Education is a durable solution to my understanding, because it provides a sustainable life for the educated scholars. Because education is a non-negotiable, it depends, on the person's hard work. There are those who never went for education. They could not enjoy, the kind of life those who have, strived in the harsh life in the camps would enjoy. So, and it pays a lot at the end for whoever, struggles in education. As from the evidences, many of the youths who completed the university degrees from the camps are now in Somalia, Horn of Africa, working with a big companies and also UN jobs in Somalia, serving their nations in participating the nation's rebuilding. Thus, many youths have, moved back to the country with all their families, children, and feeling home fiber. Investing in education is a critical aspect because it reduces the cost the UNHCR will incur for years in providing education to the people to create their livelihood activities. And it is only education that goes with you everywhere, like a passport. So like the way we show the passport, education goes with you everywhere you go. That one, is an evidence that I just want to share one, information that one friend of mine has told me, and he said that were it not from the higher education I got in the camps, I would not have turned to Somalia. I would not have returned to Somalia. Moreover, it contributed to the construction of my country. The university education I got in the Dadaab camp enables my community and me to acquire skills and knowledge to help myself. The higher education, unlocked me and made me think outside the box. Through that education, I realized that I could do everything that I should do to grow and help others succeed. This is, one of the youth who has finished the BHR project as a master, education, and now he is contesting, a leadership position, a parliament, leadership position, and he's saying that with the education I have in my head, I'm able to lead my society and redefine, the kind of conflict we are having. So without education, this person wouldn't have thought of leaving the camps. He would have been staying in the camp for years. But now he's coming with most of his families, back and seeing, a different, thing in his mind that, yes, education is a durable solution. And therefore, I believe, the higher we implement the higher education in displaced context, will enable, refugees to coexist peacefully and become a transformative force of development. And that's why I said that food will last long, wouldn't last long. If, for example, you keep on giving food, you keep on giving water, shelter, which we call them the basic, needs, that will not, that will one day end, that cannot be a durable solution. Resettlement is a durable solution, but it is not, sufficient to all. All people cannot be resettled. No one wants, to accommodate all people. People will just turn to be refugees if they think of, education is a durable solution. I mean, resettlement is a durable solution, and that's why I say that if UNHCR structures, the aid, planning, and give, hope for those who are able to perform better, and then they're given, that kinds of education in a, in a very many portion. I hope very many people will go back to their home countries and succeed. As we speak today, very minimal, people are given to this higher education, like 1% or 3%. If that could be increased to 30%, I believe that we'll have, less problems in wherever we are coming from. Thank you, Geoff. Back to you.
Thank you. In my research, whenever I've traveled and met with refugee children, the one thing that they always wanted was access to education. And UNHCR came up with creative ways of doing that, sometimes by building schools in their displaced person settlements, but equally by setting up remote learning so that the students could keep studying through materials being provided from their country of nationality. I should also add that at Essex, we've had many refugees as students over the years, and at least one of them, courtesy of coming to Essex. Her parents were Somali refugees who'd found protection in Germany. She came and studied at Essex, and she, as soon as it was possible, went back to Mogadishu to work to try and help rebuild the country. So yes, it is clear that education is a long-term, durable solution that actually isn't just for the refugee, but it's for the country of nationality too. And I should add that UNHCR in its 70th anniversary year asked that there would be pledging to allow 70 scholarships to be created for refugees to study at university. They've far outstripped that already from the donations available. And I have just seen in the panelist chat, and I'm certain it can be put into the general chat, that the Aiming Higher campaign, which is part of this, is something that everybody can contribute to help improve and increase the number of refugees who can participate in university level education. Currently, it's 3%. By 2030, the aim is for it to be at least 15%. Let me move on now to the Q&A. I have some questions already. Please type any more questions that you want into the Q&A. It's being monitored during the Q&A, and I'm getting a direct feed of those questions, even as I ask the questions to everybody else. So I want to start with one question that I know Abikar already addressed in the Q&A boxes, but I want to put it to all our panelists. It comes in from Vasiliki. And how can we as protection officers include more community-based and participatory approaches in our protection work? And I suppose, Rossella, you might want to start answering that one first as a former protection officer, but I do want everybody else to contribute as well.
But with great pleasure, Geoff. And I think it's, well, for those who want to focus more on community-based protection, I think there is a plethora of guidelines and suggestions and tools. But I think what is really important is the fact that we are really coming to the understanding that the community is where protection happens. And the community means really sitting with the refugees and working with the refugees rather than sort of coming up with a ready-made protection solution flown in from outside. I think Abikar, I think, was very clear when he sort of focused for him clearly the most important element of protection for him and for many refugee youth centers on education. And I think it's important that we listen and that we sort of try to adapt the focus of our interventions to what refugees really see that is value for them. But we need definitely, it's also about looking not just at refugees as if you wish, the recipients of protection, but also as those who can best analyze where the gaps are, suggest possible remedial action, and themselves engage in ways to protect their own community, which they already do. I think they've done it forever, except that that kind of action wasn't really recognized by the system as such. So I think there's a lot that we can do better and more. And there is a lot out there that can help anyone who is for the first time sort of starting to look at these kind of interventions to sort of get ideas of how to do it better. Over to you, Geoff.
Claire, I know you've worked with refugees in Thailand in the past. Do you have anything that you'd like to add at this point?
Not in Thailand, actually.
I apologize, Rossella. I asked Claire.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Geoff. I think it's other people are much better placed to speak on my behalf. As Rossella highlighted, Abdikadir really covered really important things that I've witnessed. But I did want to mention two things. One, putting my GAIN hat on, the Global Academic Interdisciplinary Network, because one of the things that is one of the objectives of the network is to increase this refugee-led research and involvement in academia about issues that concern refugees themselves. And I know there's work that's going on with the Global Refugee-Led Network, and we're hoping to set up a mailing list that would try to help connect the people who are looking for opportunities with those who need to be connected to these opportunities, so that really academia can tie in much better into the practice. And on the other very much more academic and more abstract side, what it was making me think of the rights-based approach under international law, which is used a lot in development, which is where individuals have rights. If they are empowered to know their rights, they are in a much better position to then claim those rights. So I work a lot in situations of armed conflict where the law is fuzzy and it's unclear who has a responsibility for who. But in order to empower, and as Abdikadir said, through education, but also through dissemination of these are your rights, this is what you have, we putting aside things of judiciability or who has the legal obligations, if people know they have their rights, they are more likely to be able to claim them. And I think that is quite an important discourse from an academic perspective, but I think also in practice to promote.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you. As the chair of the Global Academic Interdisciplinary Network, it's rather sad that I wasn't the one to mention that earlier, but thank you. I should point out that the Global Academic Interdisciplinary Network is seeking to ensure that academics around the world and students around the world get better access to research and teaching on refugee matters, and that we provide protection to scholars and students. Ahmed, Claire mentioned the rights-based approach. Do you wish to add anything to that with regard to that in the sense of how can this facilitate refugee participation in education?
I think it's vitally important that there's a rights-based approach taken with regard to education for refugees, especially given the very vulnerable position that they are faced, that they're placed in the communities that they resettle. And of course, this would again, highlight both the obligation of the state to ensure that there is availability, accessibility, affordability, and so on and so forth, but also at the same time ensuring that the education is framed as an empowering right for these individuals. And so therefore, I think that would be crucial in how states frame their policies towards refugee resettlement and education, and how also individuals are empowered to claim their rights in their fashion. Just want to comment briefly on the broader question, Geoff, if I may, on this community-based approach. In my work as for the UN on religion mandate, I find the community-based approach really a very effective one. And in fact, in many situations where the receiving communities are able to empathize with those who are coming in, then they really have a very good chance of settling in well, and being, of course, able to claim their rights. Of course, the status is a legal status, but having that supportive community, having the community integration, community support networks is crucial to ensure that the legal rights are fully enjoyed.
Abdikadir, I know you've answered this in the Q&A boxes already, but I would like you now to sort of give your personal experience and also repeat anything that you put into the box, Q&A answers for everybody to hear.
Okay, thank you, Geoff, again. I think as protection officers, working with the refugees is one thing which is very important, because it is the refugees who know, what their problems are mostly, and whenever studies are made without including the refugees, it affects a lot, because you just sit down the whole night and day planning, and at the end you come up with something that is irrelevant for the refugees, that's not helping them. You just do some messy activities. So creating community-based organization like CBO would work better, and by studying with the refugees, you will find a lot of, better solutions from the refugees themselves, because they are the actual, people who are on ground. They understand what, being protection means to them, than, just coming up with a plan and trying to sort. And maybe sometimes as you try to help them, you create more problem. So I think the idea of working with the refugees is one thing I will always welcome, because the refugees are the ones who know their problems, and no one, wants to stay in a camp unless or otherwise there is some other, obligation or some other difficulties people are facing. So working with the refugees, especially the learned refugees, and developing, research tools and researching, studying communities, coexistence, and what sustainability means for them, and what, would be without humanitarian aid is for them. So that's what I will say. And also not only doing that, but also that in collaboration with the government they are coming from. For example, if people are coming from Somalia, what is Somalia planning? What is Southern Sudan planning for these people who are outside? Uganda are planning. So if UNHCR can collaborate and work with where the origin of the displaced persons are, and looking at that as a point of change, I think we will have less refugees staying outside their countries. And maybe if, for example, they are internally displaced, and then UNHCR should be using throughout studies. The more studies, more researches are made, the more solutions are gotten. But if you just implement things without knowing why things are happening the way they are, then you will end up solving things that you never wanted to solve. So that's how I will say thank you.
Thank you. That leads us perfectly into a question from Paul Vernon. It's about the difference between how the affected communities and the international actors view protection. How do we understand the difference between humanitarian protection, community-based protection, and self-protection? I leave that open. Who would wish to speak first on that question?
Maybe if I can just start, because I think in part, I think we have already talked a bit about the distinction between humanitarian protection, community-based protection, etc. But I thought it's an interesting question about the difference between the way that refugees sometimes perceive protection and the way we do. I think one of the things that will strike anyone who goes to visits, for example, a settlement that has been there for a number of years, is the way in which refugees so to speak, absorb our own language and speak to us in a language that we will understand. I think there's nothing, I remember talking about Dadaab, where I was many years ago, meeting a woman who had no formal education, but who described herself as a single female head of household, which is really the bureaucratic label. And obviously that was for my benefit. A language I would understand. But I think refugees mostly perceive protection, of course, in terms of their needs, where they see their needs are not being met. In those days, and I don't know now because I haven't been in Dadaab in many, many years, it was very difficult to talk with anyone without ending up in the fact that protection meant resettlement to the US. It was almost an inescapable conversation anywhere. I suspect, however, that was also because they saw me as the gatekeeper. So I was the one who had to be defended, who had to be persuaded. Perhaps they would have had a different conversation with others. But I think really the question of protection sometimes, certainly the fine legal points are not really, they may be very important in reality, but they're not really often perceived by the community. The community sees in terms of the gaps and the challenge that they themselves are facing in achieving a minimal normalcy in their lives. Over to you, Geoff.
Thank you. Yes, in my own meetings with refugee communities, it's very often the case that the language that is used is the language that I would be using in class. And I'm thinking, this is not the way I talk at home, but it is the way I am talked to by communities who have to use this language in order to be able to achieve what they want to achieve. And yes, when in the army, the main part of the conversation with refugees who'd been there for decades was always about resettlement, which was next to impossible at the same time. And yet this was what was wanted. This was how they viewed protection, despite the fact that the Nigerian government was trying as hard as it could to provide them with protection in their situation. Do either Ahmed or Claire want to speak to this one before I ask? I know Abdikadir has already spoken about this, whether he wants to follow up based on what he's heard from Rossella and from me. Claire?
Yes, thanks, Geoff. I just wanted to add a small anecdote based on what Rossella just said. And I worked in education in Thailand, actually not in academia or protection. And I wouldn't want to speak on behalf of my students who would say much better things on this topic. But I do remember witnessing as a teacher some of these things where I think it was once described to me as the hot potato, which was what is the topic at the moment that gets us funding? And so these youth programs would focus on the climate or recycling, when actually these were things that didn't really mean on their day-to-day, it didn't mean much to them. It's the same with issues of gender and other things, which of course are really important. And it's for the climate is also extremely important that it gets conveyed worldwide. But these weren't priorities that had come from the communities. They were priorities that the funding bodies were requesting, because that's what, wherever their headquarters were based, were looking for. And it wasn't explicit, but these people were very clever, and they knew that if I use these words, I'm more likely to get the bid for this funding. And so the youth programs ended up looking very similar, like you said, Geoff, to what I might have seen here in Europe, when I wasn't convinced that that was actually what was, if they had chosen themselves, if they had thought what are the priorities that our community could do, regardless of funding, it might not have aligned, or it might well have aligned. But I think there is definitely a question around funding and how funding bids are phrased and provided that is really important on this topic.
Abdikadir, do you wish to add anything?
I think it has, you have almost said everything. I just wanted to say that UN tries a lot of things, and refugees have, a lot of also informations that need to be, documented and the world to see. I think for the past years, UNHCR is now, adapting on possible ways of, collaborating with the community, which has never been, in place for years. I think that was, the problem of refugees, growing, and now it is the level where they are able to speak, and express what they need. I think in the near future, we hope to have, refugees who are welcomed, in conferences, and they're able to suggest, better, and including, with refugees in every plan. I think it sorts, reduces, all the issues that are happening. But if we plan without refugees, I know we will end up having, some other, problems that are popping up. Thank you.
I come to a question from Juliana. What should be the international legal analysis of the public policies that are currently promoting a hostile environment against migrants and refugee people in European countries? Because, well, at one level, 85% of persons of concern to UNHCR are found in lower middle income countries. The reason for that is because, in part, of hostile policies from the global north that prevents the resettlement that was seen. And turning to the Global Compact on Refugees, resettlement is one of the solutions that's meant to have been grown post 2018, and yet we've actually seen it reduced post 2018. So, Rossella, I think you're probably the person to speak to that one first.
Thanks, Geoff. Yes, indeed, resettlement is one of the great disappointments of the post-global compact. We hope that we will see now, again, an uptick. But yes, it is true that despite commitments, we have actually seen a significant decrease in that. I'm not sure whether the reduction of resettlement really speaks to the question of how many people are indeed in the countries surrounding refugee crisis, because resettlement, even at its best, is never going to be able to make the sort of dent, so to speak, that you would expect in terms of the numbers we are dealing with today. I think it's extremely important as a solution for individuals. It's extremely important that in some cases as a lifesaver for persons who are vulnerable or at risk. But it remains a limited solution, as also Abikar said. So I think what the whole question of the hostile environment and the negativity we are hearing about is really much more related to spontaneous arrivals. And the fact that, of course, we are seeing very large numbers of people arriving, of course, many of whom are not refugees. I think we have to be also quite frank about it. But because the asylum channel is the only one open to them, they essentially end up all in the same basket, creating then the reactions that we know, and also the instrumentalization that we know. I mean, without going too far, this year there has been quite a pent-up debate about arrivals across the channel to the UK, when in fact total number of people arriving in the UK has decreased. So I think the way then also, I think the visibility and the impact on the public discourse sometimes matters more than the actual numbers and situations. I honestly don't know what the answer is, except saying that if we are not going to be able to choose not to have refugees, to choose not to have migrants. I think what we should really be focusing on is having a rational debate and thinking about ways of managing, rather than about thinking about ways of either pretending that they're not there, or about or thinking that we can essentially cut ourselves out from what is happening in the world and expect that everything and everyone will be dealt with elsewhere.
I assume, Ahmed, that in your work as Special Rapporteur, this has been a major issue. Do you wish to add anything?
Yes, a couple of observations. Of course, I agree that in the short term, the focus on management mitigation would be perhaps the most practical way to go about this. But I might be putting myself off the frame here, but I think we have to look at the problem in its totality in terms of, what is creating the refugee influx, as well as I would say the making a hostile environment goes beyond actually the refugee arrivals on these shores. So there are elements extraneous to the global migration crisis that are causing this hostile environment advocacy, as well as a number of factors that accelerate and contribute to the flow of refugees. But I think at the present time, given the very large volume of refugee population, and of course, which the lion's share of them being outside European shores, I think there is a huge need to focus on ensuring that there is effective protection in those areas. But at the same time, for global community to be able to really commit themselves to working on this, there ought to be a critical look at what is driving this hostile discourse, and therefore be able to look at a more positive approach to addressing this. Because the upshot of the hostile discourse is even allocation of funds for refugee management would come under hostile scrutiny. So at the end, it becomes a world in which the idea of human rights becomes untenable, because we're so if you like, nationalist, tribalist, or whatever it is that is causing intolerance. So all of the elements have to be looked into totality while we talk about what is behind this discourse of hostile environment and what impact that has on the ability to manage the global refugee crisis.
I can only say that I was in the Nairobi hub several years ago, at the time when they were doing resettlement for the whole of Kenya and working out where various refugees could go around the world. And in the same way we talked about refugees learning the language in order to be able to achieve their objectives, you could see UNHCR staff learning the language of diplomats of the various countries so that they could ensure that people were resettled. This is no way to deal with 85 million displaced persons across the planet. And we really do need, as you've just said, Ahmed, to have a global, comprehensive understanding of protection in terms of human rights and displacement. Claire, did you want to say anything before I turn to Abdikadir, who will definitely have something to say on the hostile environment, I am certain?
No, I won't say much, except that from a legal perspective, I think was made clear that, I mean, we can take it to court, we can try and enforce, there are things that are illegal and we can try and enforce that. But I think it was made clear a lot of the hostile environment isn't got to do with the law. It reflects the voters of individual countries. And to tackle this, I think you need to tackle inequality, you need to tackle racism that are very much to do with the host societies where it's being, and understand why the scapegoating is happening. Rather than, I don't think a legal route will only get so far. That's all I wanted to add.
Abdikadir, can I turn to you about hostile environment?
Thank you. I think why migrants normally move to Europe and all that is just for job opportunity, and I think one thing which is very important in UNHCR has already started is creation of awareness, on the difficulties migrants are undergoing in either illegal or some other ways of traveling to Europe. With that kind of a harsh life, people could be losing their life. So I think what UNHCR could do is, and there's a project in Somalia that works in USAID, and what it does is creations of jobs. So by the youths. So not only awareness, can sort, the problems we are having with migrants, but if, for example, UNHCR could be meeting with, the big investors in the world and giving them the ideas that they should be investing in Africa, where people are having problems, and their job is created. And if, for example, they're producing like clothes can be opened anywhere. Somalia is a very big country. Kenya is a very big country. Uganda is a very big country. Anywhere, depending on the negotiations with the host community or country. So I think that is one solution that UNHCR can do, only to facilitate between the countries on crisis and the big investors. So if they can connect this, I think we would have very many youths appreciating their own countries and having less, problems. Why people are creating problems is because they don't have activities. They don't have, that kind of engagement. So you end up, fighting and thinking that a gun is the only solution to get money, or gun is the only solution to survive. So by giving, creating that kind of job opportunities, many will be thinking of learning as one solution, and we end up having many, children going to school, and people who have never gone maybe can do an ALP learning, accelerated learning projects, or professional learning, training, just to adapt to the kind of the work needed as Europe or other countries do. So I think this is something the world, has to think about it. That UNHCR is going to 70 years now anniversary. We need to end up, humanitarian support, collecting money. It's, we normally say that you keep on calling money, money will run down. But we need to think another channel where, you know, we can create. People should be having, you know, their own thing. As long as they can get $2 to $3 by their sweat, they are all happy. So that's what I would say. Thank you.
And I will close by reminding everyone of the Global Compact on Refugees, which talks about this more holistic approach so that there is fairer and more predictable responsibility sharing by the international community as a whole. I wish to thank all our panelists, Rossella, Pagliuchi-Lor, Dr. Ahmed, Shaheed, Claire Simmons, Abdikadir, Abikar. I am so happy that we've had this opportunity. I hope you enjoyed this. And I can just remind you that in 15 minutes time, the ASILE 20 panel for Europe starts on a different Zoom link. But thank you, everybody. It's been really good participating in this. Bye for now.